Hello and welcome to this presentation about Chapter 22 of Teach Yourself Grammar, which is about content clauses. Before we discuss content clauses, some context. First of all, they are a kind of subordinate clause. Now, in the last chapter, we discussed coordinate structures, which use coordinating conjunctions, that is, the fanboys. In this chapter, as well as the next two, we will study subordinate clauses. There are three types of these. First, content subordinate clauses, which are nominals, and they function much like noun phrases. These are what we're going to discuss in the present chapter. Secondly, there are relative subordinate clauses, which are adjectival, and we will cover these in chapter 23. And finally, there are adverbial subordinate clauses, which, as the title implies, are adverbial, and we will cover these in chapter 24. Now, all these three types of subordinate clauses is headed by a subordinating conjunction. And if you think back to chapter 9, we discussed the three types of subordinating conjunctions at that time. All subordinate clauses also require an independent clause, which is called the matrix clause, which you can think of as acting like a host for the subordinate clause. Okay, so taking a closer look at content clauses. First of all, let's define them. So a content clause is just a nominal subordinate clause which is formed with one of the four patterns that we discussed in chapter 21. So these are the declarative, interrogative, and exclamatory clauses, but not the imperative pattern. The declarative content clauses begin with that. The interrogative don't move the auxiliary, and also if it's an open interrogative clause, it adds if or whether. So let's take a look at some examples. So for declarative clauses, the basic pattern is something like the story is good. So to turn that into a content clause, we just add that at the beginning. So that becomes she knows that the story is good. A closed interrogative clause has the basic pattern of something like, why is the story good? As a content clause, then it becomes, he knows why the story is good. As an interrogative that is open, we have the basic pattern, is the story good? And this becomes, in a content clause, she wonders if the story is good. We could also say whether the story is good. And finally, the basic exclamatory pattern is, if you remember, what a good story it is. And as a subordinate content clause, that might become something like, he knows what a good story it is. Thinking a little bit about the function of content clauses, they are, and this is very important, nominal in function. So if you consider noun phrases, these play two major roles. On a clause level, they act as the subject of a clause, and on the phrase level, they typically act as complements. So nominal subordinate clauses can do both, but in over 90% of cases, they're going to be complements. Specifically, they complete certain nouns, such as reason, fact, notion, etc., and verbs. Very commonly verbs like know, pretend, admit, wonder, and there's a lot more of these. For example, in the idea that pigs can fly is amusing, the verb phrase is amusing can be completed by either the idea or that pigs could fly. For example, the notion is amusing or that pigs could fly is amusing. And this basically just shows that that pigs can fly, although it might look like an adjectival, is in fact a nominal. So content subordinate clauses are always nominal in function. So another thing to keep in mind is that content conjunctions can sometimes, like most conjunctions, can sometimes be omitted. So a sentence like, I know that it's raining, can simply become, I know it's raining. if you suspect that you're dealing with a case where the content conjunction has been omitted, you can just try to reinsert it. So if you're wondering if a sentence like "I know Bob" has an underlying conjunction that has been omitted, you try to plug it back in and you will see that it does not work. So "I know that Bob" is not a complete sentence, and so therefore there isn't an underlying conjunction that has been omitted there. So in terms of usage, there are a lot of people who really do not like the construction, such as constructions like the fact that. So William Strunk and E.B. White and their Elements of Style, for example, pretty much just rule that the expression "the fact that" should be revised out of every sentence in which it occurs. And the reason for that is that they consider it to be just extra words. So taking a closer look at this rule, we can think of a sentence like "the fact that you ate the last cookie irks me" versus "that you ate the last cookie irks me." So that you can see that the first sentence, in fact, adds 2 words. But it also does sound more idiomatic, so that a construction like "that you ate the last cookie irks me" is technically correct, but is probably not a sentence that you would go around saying. So the upshot is that you should use structures like "the fact that" deliberately. In other words, you should understand what you're doing. You should know that it's going to add a few more words, and you should consider whether or not those words can be cut. And if it sounds okay and perfectly idiomatic, then go ahead and cut them. And if you have some underlying stylistic or rhetorical reason for keeping it in there, then by all means, just keep it in there. So to recap, content clauses are subordinate clauses. The independent matrix clause within which they're located is going to be more important. You can think of that matrix clause as being the boss and the content clause as being subordinate, like an employee. Second, content clauses are formed with declarative, interrogative, or exclamatory clauses, and they are going to begin with "that," "if," "whether," or a question word, such as "why" or "where." Thirdly, they're an extremely common form of nominal structure, and they mainly act as complements for certain, again, very common nouns and verbs. And finally, although they are very common, or maybe because they are, many writing gurus dislike structures such as "the fact that," "the idea that," "the notion that," because they add extra words to your writing. But there is a reason why they're so common, and that is that they're very useful. So in your writing, just decide whether or not they're worth the 2 or 3 extra words that they are going to require you to use. And if they are, then use them. But if you can get away with cutting them, then you probably want to do that.